So just give me one moment as I get my bearings in order. Okay, beautiful. Let me go ahead and share my screen and let us get started here. So today's session, everyone, is going to be about building a balanced college list. So we're going to be talking a lot about some of the common terminology that we use in college counseling as we begin to talk with you and your children about not only the totality of options that are available for them, but beginning to understand and situate where they are academically, competitively for the number of schools that they are considering. So there's going to be a lot of information about kind of the ins and outs of how Naomi and I counsel students at this stage of the process. But we're also going to give time to talk about College Kickstart, which is a program that perhaps you are hearing your children engage with. If you know are familiar with any of our current seniors and their families, perhaps you've heard about this program. But it's a really powerful and effective tool that we use in our office to support our work and helping to guide and counsel students as they're building and considering what will look like a balanced college list. So I want to provide a little bit of a framework about where everyone should be at with the process at this juncture. So I checked in with Naomi, we talked about our students and kind of where we both are in this process. And it feels like at this point, we've met the vast majority of our juniors and their families for their second meetings. If you haven't had your second meeting with myself or Naomi, you are not behind. I don't want to cause panic, but I do want to make sure that you do have the opportunity to connect with us before the end of the school year, because the second meeting is a really, really important one. And if you already had your second meeting, then these points are going to be familiar to you. Through this conversation, we've been able to talk about your child's academic interests, their college interests, help them ID and dream what they're thinking about, and really kind of help them begin planting seeds that they may or may not have considered. While I can't attest to the conversations that Naomi may have had with you, for any of you who work directly with me, you've probably witnessed that in conversations with your child, I'm asking them questions that sometimes they look at me like I have five heads. I'm asking them questions for things they've never considered. Perhaps I'm providing perspectives that they didn't think should be or could be central to their search process. And oftentimes, those questions, students are just lost. They don't quite have answers to. And in the moment, they have maybe felt a little sad, a little nervous that they didn't have an answer for that. But know that that is intentional. We're building conversations for students. We understand that they don't know what they don't know about an experience that they've only perhaps begun to dream about, right? So we're taking these opportunities to provide them questions and frameworks that we hope that through continued conversation and continued research, they begin and continue to explore the relevance of different perspectives in their particular search. We've taken some time to also talk about your child's academic performance and share their GPA with them. And then we've used that conversation to begin building a research list for your child, considering what their interests are. And you perhaps have heard us talk about schools and begin categorizing them as reaches, targets, and likelies. So I want to affirm that this is something that perhaps we use pretty regularly, but we've never really talked about in detail what is a reach, target, or likely, or how do you categorize that. And we're going to definitely take time to talk about that today. But I want to take some time to talk about GPAs because this is something that our students get tripped up about quite a bit. And I think a big part of that is because they've never had a GPA at Brooklyn Friends. And if they've been with us in middle school or in lower school, I think this concept seems even newer to them. So they look at a number and they start to panic, right? What does this mean? Is this taking into account all the rigorous courses I'm taking? Does this account for the journey that I've been through academically? And one thing top of mind for a lot of students is this what my application is reduced down to, right? Is it just all about a GPA and that's it? And these are really real and really important questions, but it's also important for us to understand, to begin to help students understand what is comprised of a GPA, what does it mean, and more importantly, help them understand that this is actually a pretty reductive number, that onto its own, it doesn't really mean all that much. So we walk them through this exercise, and I'm going to walk you all through it as well to provide a little bit more context and framing to understand what goes into a GPA. So what may be new for all of you, perhaps, is this page right here. So this is albeit a scanned and perhaps a little funky looking version of it, but this is your child's official transcript. This is what we will send out to colleges and universities. Of course, some information has been redacted and changed because this is indeed a real student's transcript, but we manipulated some of the information so it's not identifiable. So at the top here, it'll include your child's name, their address, date of birth, enrollment date, graduation date, so on and so forth. Pretty typical information that goes into an academic transcript. But this is how it looks. And what I affirm for students and what we tell them is that the first thing that you'll notice perhaps about a transcript, despite this piece right here, is that we actually don't provide a GPA. So the GPA is only for internal purposes. It's calculated by the College Counseling Office. It is only ever viewed by the College Counseling Office. In fact, there is no one else at Brooklyn Friends School who knows your child's GPA besides Naomi and I. So I just want to remind you all of that. And I'll explain a little bit later as to why we do that and why that matters. But really, when we're looking at evaluating a GPA and we're rather evaluating a student's transcript, this is what we're looking at, right? We're looking at the slate of courses that your child has taken. We're looking at the trajectory of your child's academic transcript. And kind of this is a key and critical piece of information that goes for college admissions officers for them to begin to really understand your child's academic history. So in this fictitious transcript, there's a couple of things that I just want to kind of bring your eyes and attention to. First, you'll perhaps notice that we have final grades that aren't consistent for every year. And in this particular transcript, you see that final grades are beginning to be assigned 11th grade. For your children, this happened last year, so they will have final grades for 10th grade, for 11th grade, and for 12th grade, but not for 9th grade. And that's a note that we make at the bottom of the transcript, right? But as you're looking at it line by line, I want to help you understand how is it that an admissions officer is viewing this, right? Because they are going to be taking very close look at every single course that your child has taken, the sequence in which those courses have been taken, and importantly, as they begin to engage with the IB program, the particular sequence of courses that they are taking if they're either full IB candidates or if they're taking the certificate route as well. So they'll look at the standard level courses, they'll look at their higher level courses, and then of course there's other requirements that students need to fulfill for Brooklyn Friends School, right? So they're looking at these piece of information line by line, and they're looking at it semester by semester, right? So what they're trying to understand and gather information on are trends. What is it that the student has been doing these last 3 or 4 years? How are they performing? Is there any discernible patterns that emerge from your child's academic performance, right? And as you can imagine, that piece of qualitative information will vary from student to student. And this is why it's really helpful for us to understand what your child's academic journey has looked like, right? Because if we were to look at this particular transcript and I provided no context to you about what this, and I ask you, what does this transcript mean, right? You can make some assumptions here. You can say, okay, this is mostly an A, B student, started off pretty strong 10th, 9th, and 10th grade, but ran into some bumps. However we wish to define bumps, more so in their second semester of their junior year, right? I think that's factually true. We can see that. However, what we don't know is what has been happening in the life of the student at this juncture, right? For this particular student, did the IB curriculum really challenge them in important ways that has forced them to think about different studying strategies and time management strategies? We don't know. Is this an example of a student who maybe had some really difficult health issues or things were going on at home that distracted them or pulled them away from their academic studies? We don't know. Is there something else that's going on here that's impacting the way a student is navigating and showing up every day in class? We don't know. And those pieces of information are critically important to provide helpful context to understand a student's journey through Brooklyn Friends. One of the first questions that we ask students in our individual meetings is to have them describe their academic journey in their own terms. What worked well, what didn't work well, what are they continuing to improve on, what are some goals that they are setting for themselves. And I will name that for a lot of our students, they don't quite know how to verbalize their journey yet because they haven't taken the time to really make sense of what happened in the last 3 years. But it's really, really important that we continue to unearth and really help students articulate their journey because part of our counseling, and more importantly, in our recommendation letters, is helping to provide context to an admissions officer to help them understand exactly what has gone on in their lives over the past couple of years that have impacted their academic journey for the better or for the worse, right? So this is part of the conversation that we've been having with students and helping them see that as they're viewing a transcript has helped their gears continue to turn and to think about their own particular journey as well, right? But part of this exercise is also helping to understand that a GPA unto itself can mean and look so differently, right? So when we calculate this particular GPA, and when we do it internally, we are calculating grades based off of credits and your final grades, except for ninth grade. So semester one and semester two count differently. We have a calculator that we use to help us come up with the GPA. And for this particular student, their GPA was a 3.62, right? So just keep in mind the overall trends and journeys that you're perhaps observing. But if we look at another transcript for another fictitious student, right, you're seeing a slightly different picture. One where you're seeing a really strong ninth grade, right? But then 10th grade happens. We're seeing some B's, a couple, just a C here. And then the bouncing back up to 11th grade with their IBs and mostly getting A's with the exception of a few B's, right? Totally different journey, different twists and turns. This is still about a 3.6, right? So again, we're really trying to drill home this idea that a 3.6 or any GPA for that matter can look really different for different students. And lastly, just another example of another student with a different academic profile, perhaps a really challenging ninth grade, right? And for your children with COVID and the start of a perhaps new school community and it being virtual, maybe this is true for them, right? Just that really, really challenging ninth grade and really just adjusting to perhaps a new school community, a new academic tempo, had a little bit of a bumpy start, but really has had that stark upward trend from 10th and into 11th grade, and still another student with a 3.6 GPA, right? So we want to present this information to you all, and we did so for your students to really complicate and kind of help students not reduce their entire experience to a singular number and to re-emphasize that a GPA onto itself doesn't mean much without context. It can mean very different things based on how your child has navigated and performed throughout the 3 years thus far. And importantly, which these three examples didn't quite show, but it also can, a GPA may not fully capture a child's rigor, right? And the ways in which they navigated the IB program here at Brooklyn Friends. You can have two children with identical GPAs, but one child has taken the full IB diploma course, and then the other student has taken the certificate pathway. So they're not taking the extended essay, they're not taking theory of knowledge. So again, they may numerically be comparable, but when you look at the when you look at the transcript and you look at the course rigor, that's going to paint slightly different pictures. So it's really important to understand that the GPA is just one metric, and even at that, a really imperfect metric. So certainly, this is a number that we will use as a part of the conversation about building a balanced college list. But I also offer this because as you're working and engaging with different admissions officers, it is very likely that you're maybe coming up with data points that or admissions officers are saying in their info session that their average GPA is this, whatever magic number that is, assuming that it's on a 4.0 scale, which not all of them are. So I present this information to remind you to always challenge that there's perhaps something more that's happening. Or more importantly, don't let that number scare you because there's so much other pieces that are going into your child's evaluation when they're applying for colleges and universities, right? I don't want to undermine the fact that academics matter, and we'll talk about a little bit why later, but it's only part of the story when we're thinking about college admissions. And more specifically, we're thinking about holistic college admissions. So that's going to be a term that you may hear time and time again as you're interacting with admissions officers, as you're sitting on webinars, as you are listening to information sessions. Many schools engage in what they consider to be holistic review processes, which means that they're looking and considering every single component of the application and how they interact with one another to kind of create the complete applicant, right? It is always going to be restricting. They're only asking specific information that's not going to capture the totality of who your child is, but they are asking for pieces of information that when they interplay with one another does help them understand, at least as best as possible, who your child is and their fit for that particular institution. So quickly, I want to run through the different parts of the application that admissions officers are considering alongside your child's academic profile, right? So letters of recommendation, and we're going to talk a little bit about that later, but this is an admissions officer's opportunity to understand who your child is as a student and the contributions they make as an intellect, as a scholar, and the things that really get them motivated and energized academically. But it also can be important information to illustrate who your child is as a community member and how do they make impact within Brooklyn Friends and beyond. And it's also an opportunity, especially in our counsel letters, to share relevant context that either provides more information about a student's academic journey or more context about how your child has navigated Brooklyn Friends or life at large that the application onto itself may not neatly capture. Admissions officers are going to also look at your child's extracurricular activities. And for this, I always tell students and families, it's not as important what you do, but really why you do it, right? So that intentionality piece is something that I work with students really hard to help them articulate why is it that they do whatever it is that they do. And to really center the fact that, a part-time job is no more or less significant than doing research, or being a part of the basketball team isn't somehow magically better than being a part of the softball team, right? These things all exist for reasons. Your child are doing and engaging in these activities for a reason. And our hope and our work together is really unearthing why it is that they do the things that they do. Interviews can also be another important part of the application process. Interview policies will vary by school to school. Some schools require interviews, others, it may be optional. Some may be conducted by alumni, others might be conducted by current students. So it really runs the gambit in terms of how and when and why you should participate in them. But my rule of thumb is always, if an interview is offered, take it. Whether it's informational or evaluative, it's a really good opportunity and a really good practice skill for students beyond even the college application process, right? We will, of course, work with your children if for any interview that they're taking on, as whether it's, they're super skilled and comfortable with interviews, or this is the first interview they've ever had. We will work to prepare them to do that. They're always really, really good practice, not only for college, but for life as well. Testing, which is our best friend. We love talking about testing. It is a thing that I wake up every day and I'm just like, wow, can I take more tests in my life? And if you can't tell by me rolling my eyes, testing is not my favorite thing to do, but we recognize that it is a part of the process here, right? The good news is, and for many of our students, is that we are hearing from colleges that by and large, most of them will remain test optional for the next academic year. Some schools have already made announcements that they are going to be test optional forever, which is really great and kind of isn't a testament to the ways in which college admissions officers have been able to make decisions about students who are good academic fits for their institutions. And there's data now to prove that despite not having test scores, they are still thriving at their institution. So we will continue to take and monitor what the testing policies are at different institutions. And if there are institutions for which testing is required or testing is optional, but we know it makes a really big impact, we will make sure that you and your child know that as we talk about schools that fall into that particular category. But importantly, testing is going to be really critical, and I would argue a central component of your child's search process if if they are considering international institutions where their IB results are going to be the basis for their admissions. So please be mindful of that. We talked about that a couple sessions ago, but for international admissions, your child's IB exam results are going to be really, really critical and central to their search. Writing is going to be an important element of the search process as well, both in terms of the personal statement, which all students will have to write some version of. It's a 650-word essay about a piece of your child's life. It is not a resume. It is not a thesis of every single life event. It is one moment, one snapshot, one piece of a 1,000-piece puzzle of their life that they're choosing to amplify and highlight. And we will talk a lot about that towards the end of the semester, but know that that is one big piece of this process that students will be working on towards the end of the school year, over the summer, and most certainly into the fall. Similarly, writing supplements are going to be a really big part of your child's application process. Many colleges are going to ask some question that helps them better understand your child. The most popular question that is asked is, why do you want to attend our institution? And if you remember last week's presentation about effective college research, what we talked about then is in preparation for that particular question, right? Because they want to be able to understand what are your child's academic interests, no matter how broad or specific they may be, and has your child done enough research to be able to articulate why they think they are a good fit for that particular university. So writing supplements aren't going to exist for every college and university out there, but they are going to exist for a probably good portion of the schools that your child might consider. So you just know that's a part of the puzzle. And lastly, arts portfolio. This is not going to be something that pertains to most of our students, but for any student who is thinking about a conservatory style education, whether that's in the performing arts or the fine arts, or if there's programs that they are interested in, majors that they're interested in, or they know that the performing or fine arts is a really important part of who they are, and they want that to be a part of the consideration in the review process, an arts portfolio may be something that your child may wish to engage in. What I want to say about all of these pieces, though, is that it all talks in many ways to one another. And there's not one component that stands out more than the other, right? It really does depend on your child and their gifts and their strengths and how that emerges in the application process, right? For some students, it's going to become abundantly clear, right? Maybe your child is an excellent writer and they're a creative writer, and that's what they want to do in college. And their personal statement and their writing supplements is their opportunity to show off their writing chops, right? Maybe that's something that will really stand out for your child, and that's amazing. Maybe your child is not a good writer, and that's a growth edge for them, right? And for those students, we're going to work to produce an essay that they're going to feel really strong and good about, but maybe that's not their strength in the application. Maybe it's their recommendation letter where teachers are saying that this is the top scholar that they've ever had in their career, or this is a student who is so intellectually curious and really advances classroom conversations. And maybe that stands up for that child. For another child, maybe it's their extracurricular involvements and the ways in which they're showing leadership at Brooklyn Friends and beyond, right? Maybe that's what's really kind of the thing that really helps your child stand out. So, as you can imagine, all of these factors are going to look different for every child. And what will stand out for your child, is kind of depending on how they're navigating their world and their spaces. We're going to work together to make sure that as they're constructing their application, every piece is as glowing, as strong as it may be, but recognize that there's going to be different strengths for different students, and that's absolutely okay. Back to the conversation about recommendation letters. So this is not news and should not be news to anyone at this juncture. I sent out an email Monday morning with pretty clear instructions for students about what they need to do, but to emphasize anew to families about what we are asking for in terms of our process for students requesting letters of recommendation. So by and large, most students are going to be needing 2 teacher recommendations for their college admissions process. They should be from teachers who can attest to your child's academic strengths and developments within their class. I've told students since we began junior seminar that they may be thinking about a teacher who's not necessarily the one who gave them the best grade, but it could be the teacher for whom they know how hard your child works in their class. Maybe they're really consistent about showing up for office hours. Maybe they're really good about making revisions on essays or exams to demonstrate their growth and understanding. Perhaps they're the child who is really good about being group leader, like being really good group members and are really excellent in that particular setting. Or maybe your child's the one that's constantly contributing meaningfully in a classroom setting, right? These are the kinds of considerations that I hope students are thinking about as they're gearing up to begin asking for teacher recommendation letters, right? So we really want to make sure that it's not necessarily the teacher who the child thinks is their friend, but really the teacher who can really talk to their strengths in the most positive light possible, right? We are asking because most colleges have a strong preference that recommendation letters come from teachers from this year. And the reason for that is because this is the most current version of your child as a student and as a scholar, right? It doesn't mean that there's not validity in place for teachers that they may have had last year or even in ninth grade. But if that's not someone that your child has had in the recent, then perhaps they're not capturing the kind of current form of who your child is as a student. So it's really important that they are considering first 11th grade teachers. And if there are exceptions, which there always are, they should make sure that they talk to me or Naomi about that. The two teacher letters should come from, though it doesn't have to exclusively be, from subject areas that are in alignment with what your child may study in college, right? It's not a hard and fast rule, but if your child wants to do political science, as an example, perhaps it makes sense to have at least one recommendation letter come from a humanities teacher. If your child's interested in pre-med, perhaps it's important to at least have at least one recommendation come from a math or science teacher. There are very hard and fast rules in college admissions about who the letters should come from. So really think about that balance as you're thinking about the teachers that your child may ultimately ask. But there are a few exceptions to this rule. So if you know or you have an inkling that your child may want to apply to MIT, Caltech, or Harvey Mudd, they are very specific about who they want to see in with your recommenders. They also ask for two teacher recommendations, but one letter must be from a math or science teacher. The second must be from a humanities teacher. So if you know your child is thinking about any of these three schools, this is something that we just want to be mindful of. Otherwise, it's really open to the child. And again, to think about which adult in the community knows them best as students, right? So we've asked students to begin asking, or rather, to begin by first submitting a Google form that I sent out on Monday, which is where they will indicate the two teachers that they wish to ask. Once we receive that information, Naomi and I are going to review all of the requests. If it makes sense, if we're in alignment, we will email your child and we'll say, hey, this is a great idea. You're good to go. Please reach out to your teachers and confirm with us once they say yes. If we're going to ask them to go in a slightly different direction, for whatever reason that may be, we'll ask students to come in and speak with us before they do anything. And there may be a couple compelling reasons why we're asking students to do this. Ultimately, there may be some other factors that the child is unaware of, and we're just trying to mitigate awkward or difficult conversations. Or perhaps there's something that the child is not seeing quite fully, or maybe we have a different vision based off what we know from the students' teachers, or what we have read ourselves in their narrative reports. So if we ask them to come speak to us, don't and if they're panicking, they're concerned, tell them not to worry. We got their best interest at heart, and we'll figure it out. Our hope is that by the 24th of May, all students have completed the requests, they have their teachers settled, and we can move forward. So I will send weekly reminders to students about this information, but if your child has not already asked and filled out that Google form, encourage them to do that in the next coming days. So as we talked about holistic admissions, and we talked really briefly about the different components that admissions officers are going to review in the process, at this juncture, we recognize that we've only had 2 meetings with your child. We've seen them in junior seminar. Perhaps we spent time with them in the college tour. We've seen them in their natural elements. We're getting to know our students and really kind of know them intimately, right? But we're still learning a lot about them. So as we're making predictions about their list, the balance of their college list, and what our determinations about whether schools will reach a target are likely, We are still operating on incomplete information, and we recognize that. A big important piece, though, that we are relying on now and we will continue to rely on is their academic profile, right? Ultimately, while I want to continue affirming that the academics aren't the end all be all, it is a good marker to at least assess, is your child, can they get their foot in the door in terms of admissions to any particular college or university, right? I can say from working in admissions, you're making decisions not because you want to do a favor for a student, right? Like you really love them, you think they'd be great for your institution. But if there's evidence that they're struggling academically and you'll have concerns about their ability to thrive at your particular institution, that is a pretty clear reason why we may recommend a student to be rejected, right? It's not because we want to be mean people, but it's because we want to make sure that whoever is admitted to a particular university is not only going to be able to survive, but can thrive. And that there's evidence in the application of a student's ability to do just that, right? So this is why academics do matter. And they're a really key component in the admissions process because the admissions officers want to understand, are you going to survive academically at our particular institution, right? So right now, as we're making these early determinations, this is a big piece that that we are holding center to our counseling. And of course, we will adjust not only as we learn about different initiatives or directives from the colleges as they close out this year and as we look forward to the fall, but certainly as we get to know who your child is, the strengths that they're bringing to the application, their specific academic interests, so on and so forth. So when we're thinking about building a college list and working to support our children to think about a list that feels appropriate, feels balanced, and has a good safety net, right? We are using three distinct categories that you've heard me talk about earlier in this presentation. So reach, target, and likely, right? So this has all to do with your child's academic performance up until the point in which they apply, and that's relative to the academic profile that a particular college or a university admits students for, right? So I want you to think about two things. One is that a reach, target, and likely in the categorization is always relative to your child's academic performance, right? So a school onto itself is not a likely. A school onto itself is not a reach. It always depends on your child's academic performance. And for one student, I may say, the University of Connecticut is a target for you, given your interest and given where you are academically. But for another student, I may say, given where you are academically, it may be a reach for you, right? So understand that as we're thinking about these categorizations, it's always relative to your child, right? I also want to encourage you to think about this as a continuum more so than three distinct categories, because there will be colleges that may emerge on your child's college list that are more aspirational, right? That may be really highly selective or far out from where the college traditionally accepts students from, right? Just like there's some schools that are more likelier than others, right? Perhaps they really take in a big proportion of their incoming class, or your child's academic profile is far exceeding what they historically do. It doesn't mean that a likely means you are 100% guaranteed that you're admitted, but it means that odds are you are more admissible than not, right? And of course, there's other factors that may play into that. So if we were looking at a fictitious college, right? And if we think about the last 5 years of what's happened at that particular school, and we look at data points, let's say specifically at what happened at Brooklyn Friends School, and we would map them out in a normal distribution curve, and we would say, hey, you fictitious student that we're working with, if you're looking at a school that historically has admitted students with GPAs between a 3.3 and a 3.5, but your GPA is at a 3.15, it is likely that we will categorize that particular school as a reach, right? Because your GPA is falling below the median, the kind of mid 50% of how that particular college behaves in terms of admissions, right? If your GPA landed between a 3.3 and a 3.5, we would say it's a target. It means that you are within range of what the college historically does. So that means that this is like a pretty good sweet spot here, right? Like, of course, there's going to, as always, there's other factors that are at play, but it means your foot's in the door. We're in a good spot. Or if your GPA is far exceeding that, 3.3 to 3.5 range, it means that that school is a likely, which means that all things considered, academically speaking, you are above profile for what that school tends to do. So again, doesn't mean that this is a 100% guarantee that you're being admitted, but all things considered, you are really, really, really competitive for that, right? So this is part of what we're doing as counselors and the work that we're doing to help your children and you understand where you may land for any number of colleges that you're thinking about. And as your child is thinking about the number of schools and the balance of schools that they're ultimately applying into, this is a framework that we really want you to hold center, right? Because we want to make sure that we're balancing pragmatism with aspirations, right? And this has to do with kind of how you then begin to build a college list. So one shift that I want to name for this year is that last year, or rather for this senior class right now, we did institute a limit on a number of schools that students can apply to. Part of the reason that I instituted that was because I really just wanted to make this process as simple and streamlined for students as possible. I did not want to encourage students to get overwhelmed and feel like they need to apply to 30 plus schools when I know that honestly, you can have a really amazing list with 8 schools and you can be done and really happy if you are really thoughtful about every single school that you're applying into, right? But based on some of the feedback that we've gotten back with students and from families, we decided to back away from that, giving you back the power and the agency to make that decision on your own. We will support whatever a student wants to do, right? But we're also going to help them understand what does going above and beyond look like and what does that mean? So this year, on average, our students planned for sending about 12 applications, right? Not every student did because of perhaps getting in early decision, or maybe they got into a school early action and ended up applying to fewer schools. But before any decisions went out, the average number of schools that students applied to was 12, right? When I first started here at Brooklyn Friends, there was no cap, and I had a student apply to 24 schools. Not the best use of the students' time. They were really adamant about doing it. We supported them. It was as best as it could be. But what I constantly reminded this student, and what I will remind students moving forward, is you have to think about this in terms of an opportunity cost. The more applications that you submit, the high likelihood that you also have to write an equal number of supplements. And that means a diminishing return on application strength of sorts, right? Because that means more time focusing on your college applications, less time per essay that you're focusing in on, and perhaps even more time that you're pulling away from your academics when your academics will matter quite a bit your senior year, right? I remind students that, I think that the misconception, right, or perhaps the incomplete framework for understanding transcripts is that the junior year is somehow this unicorn year that matters the most. And there is reasons why junior year matter, especially with the IB and kind of seeing how your child is undergoing that. But also, depending on when they apply next year, if they apply early decision or early action or any early program, we are going to be sending out mid-semester grades. We recognize and we share with admissions folks that these are snapshots, that perhaps there's only one assessment that's behind these grades, but colleges want to know kind of how students are performing at the time that they apply. So we are sending mid-semester grades. And for those students who are going into regular decision, we don't send mid-semester grades, but we will send semester 1 grades. So it's really important that your child keeps that stamina going and making sure that they're performing at minimum at the same level that they ended their junior year with. So it's really important to keep that in mind, keep that center as you're talking with your child, and certainly when we move into the fall, about how does it that we do this process in a way that feels healthy, that in a way that feels balanced, and in a way that's not detracting from your child's academic performance, because we want to make sure that we are sustaining that as much as possible. As your child is thinking about a number of colleges, what our recommendation is, and we strongly, strongly, strongly recommend that students heed to this, is that they apply to at least 2 to 3 likely colleges and 3 to 4 target colleges. So really constituting your child's foundation, their base, their core of sorts, right? These should be the schools that your child are most excited about because these are the schools that they are most competitive for, right? I know because I've done this work long enough that for many students, the reach schools feel like the dream schools. Sometimes it's because it is the dream school. Sometimes it's because it's just categorized as such, right? But we want to make sure that your child is being intentional about every school that they're applying to and not wasting any motions, right? So as I mentioned earlier, I want your child to be aspirational. I want them to stretch themselves outside their comfort zone. I want them to feel comfortable that they've earned the right to apply to any college that their heart feels desire to apply to, because my philosophy tends to be to not approach this process with a fear and making sure that you don't go through this process with regret, right? And certainly we want to balance both the realism of how selective some colleges can be with how your child potentially deals with negative news, right? Like this is a part of the process and a part of the process that we are going to handle delicately and we will be immensely responsive to, right? But I don't want children to fear the unknown because it's really hard when this time next year, if they let that fear be all consuming, they have an option and they just feel, I really wish I went for a different direction. I wish I didn't let that fear get the best of me. So this is something that we are working on to always amplify and affirm your child to let them know, hey, if this is what you need to do, let's do it. And let's make sure that we are giving our 1000% effort, but also balancing the pragmatic element of this process, which is understanding what's going to be possible, what's going to be within reach, what's going to be a little bit harder to attain, right? And being thoughtful and mindful that just because we may say a school is a reach or a little bit of a further reach, that doesn't mean that we don't believe in your child. That doesn't mean that they're not going to get in. In fact, I love being proven wrong, right? I get no joy of seeing a student sad because they were denied somewhere. I want them to get everything they want, right? But our job is to help manage those expectations so that, they're being pragmatic and realistic, but also, again, sprinkling in that aspiration too, because that's really important for their particular process. So it's something that I just want to make sure that I continuously center through our work together. It's important to understand too that right now we are in a very preliminary stage of the process and priorities will shift for students. So one day they're telling you that they like a college because of X, but 3 months from now that feels completely different. Just give your child the space for that to be true. Because we know that the more that they ask themselves these big questions, the more that they see what's out there and they evaluate what's right for them, their priorities may shift and we completely understand that, right? I also encourage students to like their likelies. Time and time again, when we go through this process and I ask students how they feel, I ask students to reflect on their choices and their outcomes, you know, children more often than not will say, well, I'm glad it worked out because I didn't want to go to my likelies. Or maybe I'm thinking about one school and a bunch of likelies, but these likelies, I don't like them. I never liked them. I just applied for the sake of it, right? And what I want to always emphasize to students now and in the fall is that it's important to like their likelies. They don't have to love them. And I recognize that they're not going to be on the same pedestal as their aspirational schools or their dream schools, but they should exist on the list for a reason. And perhaps your child thinks about likely options with the most stringent categories, right? Maybe they don't care about the weather and they will be happy to go anywhere as long as it's a school that's the right fit. But if they love the warmth and if they're going to be happy at a likely school that so happens to be warm, maybe that's a great way to point them in that particular direction. Or maybe they want to be somewhere close to home. Or maybe they want to go to a college where there can be some assurance for merit money. Whatever that may be, if they need to be a little bit more discerning of their likely options, let them and give them space to do that because they should like every school that's on their list, maybe for different reasons, but they should like them all together. And lastly, what I will mention is that your child's final list isn't due to our office until mid-November. So there's still 7.5 months or so before your child needs to officially proclaim where it is that they are applying to. Certainly, there's some exceptions for colleges that may have earlier deadlines in November, but for the most part, when we're thinking about the total list, this doesn't happen until November. So there can be ways that you may want to think about or strategize how you help to support your child through their research and decision-making process, but there's still time for these things to be considered. And I want to make sure that students and you all know that as we move forward in our work together. So the last piece that I want to spend time with you all talking today is College Kickstart. It is a tool that we are introducing to students as they go through junior seminar. So we have already gone to 2 of our sessions. Our last class session will meet this Friday. So at that juncture, every student will have access to College Kickstart. And I want to make sure that I am spending some time talking with you all and really helping you all understand what College Kickstart is. So it is a really helpful and powerful tool that can be used in partnership with our counseling to determine the balance of your child's college list. Unfortunately, the way that College Kickstart is set up, we only have licenses for students, not parents. So it's important that as your child is signing into College Kickstart, that you are also looking alongside with them. Hopefully they're sharing their passwords so you can just play around with the tool with them. But it's a really, really, really helpful tool. So I'm going to give you all kind of the whirlwind overview of what this program is, and then we'll open it up for any questions and answers at the end. So when your child logs into College Kickstart, this is going to be their dashboard. This is going to be their profile. Students can list up to 30 schools that they're interested in, and if they so feel compelled, they can rank order them too. They can also put hearts next to schools that they really love. Maybe it's their top choice. Maybe it's a school that they know they would apply early to. Maybe it's a school that if they got in tomorrow, they would go without questions, right? So you can do that for up to 2 schools. For some of these schools, you're going to see this little designation of this HS. So what Kickstart is doing is that for any school where there's at least 10 applicants who've applied from the last 5 years at Brooklyn Friends, it is making determinations about whether a school is a reach, target, or likely based on what has happened historically at Brooklyn Friends. And this is really powerful, and this is really important information because it's more of an insight as to what happens for our students and specific to our community. And it's interesting when you look at that data versus what happens nationally, right? As we'll show a little bit later, you'll see that for some schools, their admit rate from Brooklyn Friends for the last 5 years sometimes can be significantly higher than it is for their national admit rate, right? Which is really interesting. And there's a lot to be said about why that happens, but it's something to think about and to consider, right? So for any school that your child is entering, if there is an HS designation, it means that it is pulling from Brooklyn Friends applicant data. Now, we are a small school, data is limited. We're not going to have that level of information for all colleges, right? So in this example, if a student's looking at Northwestern, it doesn't mean that we haven't had students apply to Northwestern in the past. We just don't have enough data points to make this information reliable. So it will pull from national data that's reported to the federal government about admission data and admissions trends. On the right-hand side, your child's academic profile will be there. Their GPA will automatically be loaded. So that's the same number that you'll see on SCORE. Your child can input testing if they have it. If they don't have it, you can still run the program, but you can manipulate this to see how testing could potentially impact the way that College Kickstart makes certain categorizations, right? So definitely play around with it and see what happens, right? You'll notice here that this GPA on the profile is a weighted GPA. I'm going to get to that point later. This is the part that it causes a bit of confusion. So just bear with me as I explain that, but I'm going to get to that right later. So you just know that the number that's automatically populated for a child is an unweighted GPA. And that is the number that we use on SCORE and the number that we use in our counseling. So when you run Kickstart, and bear with me, it takes a little time as the program thinks a bit, it is trying to give you information about the balance of your overall college list, right? So it's giving you information about, how it determines a college should be categorized as a reach, as a target, as a likely. And it's also trying to give you information about how and when to apply. This is the piece of Kickstart that I say, look at if it's interesting, but don't take this to heart, right? This is a program that's making assumptions based off of 2, maybe 1 data point, right? The big data point being your child's GPA. So as we talked about earlier, there's so much more than just a GPA, right? And there's a lot more even embedded within that, but it's trying to assess that idea of, can your child get their foot in the door with this one particular metric, right? So there are good things to Kickstart. There are some drawbacks. So I say this and emphasize that you should always, always, always talk to your child's counselor before making any kind of final determinations, right? So as you go through it and you go through the list check, College Kickstart is going to give you information about what schools it is determining to be reaches, targets, likelies, and unlikelies. Unlikely as a categorization for me feels a little mean. I don't like to use the term unlikely. But once again, if you think about an earlier slide and you think about this as a continuum as opposed to distinct categories, that's, I think, a much more helpful visual cue than these particular categories. But Kickstart wants you to have, similar to our policy, at least two likelies, at least three targets, and then supplemented by two reaches, right? You can use Kickstart as an opportunity to find more likelies based on your academic profile, and then you can filter it out based on some big priorities that your child might be considering, and it'll spit out a list of schools that you may want to consider. As we go through the early strategy component, again, this is tied to the rank order that your child put the schools in and those two hearts that it indicated, right? Because what College Kickstart is trying to do is signal to your child, hey, if you love your number one choice and they have some kind of early program and your academic profile puts you in a competitive edge to apply early, maybe you should think about applying early. And this way, if you get in, you are also saving money too, right? Or in this case, maybe your first choice is an early decision school that allows you to apply to early action schools. Here are some early action schools that are on your list that you should consider applying to, right? So just some helpful information. And it says if you apply in wave one, so your early decision, early action schools, and you potentially get in, it'll even tell you how much money you save in application costs, which should show up here. It does. Oh, it does. That, if you get in, let's say BU ED1, you are potentially saving $265 in fees. Again, take it for what it's worth. Don't take it for gospel. I wouldn't, again, make a firm plan solely based on this, but it is good information and some good things to be considering, right? When you go to the details page, this is where it has some really helpful context, some really helpful information. And for any of you who love data and are not intimidated by it, this is a page that I would encourage you all to spend some time looking into and assessing, right? But the piece that I want to draw your attention to here is the academic performance assessment, right? So this is what Kickstart is pulling from the last 5 years of Brooklyn Friends applicant data that we have access to with regards to students' GPAs and with regards to testing profiles, right? So if your child has a test score, it'll tell you where that historically lands, right? And also gives you some really good information about the percentage of students who submitted test scores for this past application cycle, right? So they're doing a really good job still filtering through information that isn't the most fun to find, but it's really helpful to understand, especially if you're thinking about, well, should I submit my scores or should I not submit my scores, right? So you can look at this as one data point. The second piece I'm going to draw your attention to is the GPA. So a little bit of the funkiness of Kickstart is based on how we calculate our GPAs. So we are a school that operates at a 4.0 scale, again, internally. But the way that we calculate our GPAs, an A plus is converted to a 4.3. So theoretically, if your child has had A pluses for every course, every semester, they can have a GPA unweighted as high as a 4.3. It makes the data a little bit funky. So Kickstart on the back end translates that 4.0 GPA scale onto a 5.0 GPA scale. So a weighted 5.0. So it's not weighted based on IB curriculum. It's rated just a different scaling to make sure that every data point that we have access to exists on a kind of similar playing field. So for the purposes of College Kickstart, in the notes section here, it will tell you that your GPA, the 3.5, corresponds in Kickstart to a weighted GPA of a 4.0 on a 5.0 scale, right? So this is a piece of information that trips up students, it trips up families, So just make sure that if your child or you are confused about what this means, it is here in the academic performance piece of the detailed plan, and it tells you exactly what that translates into, right? So for a student who's perhaps applying to BU out of a 5.0 scale, they're at a 4.0, it puts them just slightly above what has historically happened at Brooklyn Friends. So this is why it is categorizing BU for this fictitious student as a target. Their ACT, which we input as a 28, falls slightly below. So Kickstart is going to say you should probably do test optional, right? And this is another piece where Kickstart is particularly fickle. If you're 1 point away from that mid 50%, it's going to make the school more selective than perhaps what it would appear. Is my counseling that minute? No, but it is something just to keep in mind that like these slight deviations may account for bigger jumps in Kickstart than what they are in reality, which is why it's also important to not think about reaches, targets, and likelies as three categories, but more so as a continuum. The last piece that I really, really like about Kickstart, perhaps a little bit not so organized, or even if you're the most organized person, it does the organization tools for you. So when you look at a particular sample plan, it is going to give you information about kind of the broad strokes of every school that you're considering, right? It'll tell you about what it's categorizing the school as, whether you should apply test optional or not, given where you are if you're testing, when to apply, the due dates, fees, so on and so forth. There's two things I want to make sure that I am emphasizing here. One is admit rate. So you'll see for schools like UVM or BU or Elon or Oberlin or Vassar that you're seeing admit rates that if you're thinking, wow, that's high, your instincts are correct, right? BU's admit rate this year dropped to 10% overall. Historically at Brooklyn Friends, it's sitting around 43%, right? So you get to see what does a Brooklyn Friends education do. In part, you're seeing it in terms of these admissions rates and how affirmative our students are being read in the process, right? So this can give you some really good hope about what's within the realm of possibility for students, right? Um, the other piece that I want you all to pay particular attention to is demonstrated interest. So demonstrated interest is something that schools are paying close attention to. If they need to make decisions based on your likelihood to attend, they may think about how you engage with their school as a part of the selection process. So, have you attended info sessions? Have you opened up emails? If they came and visited Brooklyn Friends, did your child attend that particular session? So it's really important, and we will work with you all to identify those schools where demonstrated interest really matters. But if you are looking at your child's Kickstart account and it says very important or important, please make sure that you are taking that into account and encouraging your student to have some form of engagement with the university, even if it's just an email or checking the email that the school sends. The requirements view is going to also give you an insight as to all the pieces that are going to be required in your child's application process. It's all hyperlinked. So if you want to see information about a school's interview policies, all you have to do is click the link and it's going to take you to that particular page. This will be updated in August for the 2023-2024 season. But what I tell students to think about now and to continue to think about is the level of work that they may have to do considering the number of schools that they apply for, right? So whenever you see base, this corresponds to the Common App essay, that 650-word essay that they're writing for all colleges, plus the supplements that they have to write for each school. So they may see, wow, this work is going to pile up pretty quickly. Let me make sure that I'm working over the summer to get ahead of some of these things, right? So really good information. And lastly, I want to be mindful of time. I know I'm running a little bit over, is that there's also really good financial information about these schools as well, right? So need-based aid is giving you information about the percentage of need-based financial aid these colleges offer. So the one I always want to take a look at and center and add to schools students list as much as possible are those schools that meet 100% of your family's demonstrated need. So if your family needs the full cost of attendance to attend, the school will provide you the full cost of attendance to attend, right? This is not the reality for the vast majority of schools across the country. We want to make sure that if financial aid or affordability is an important part of your search process, that we're taking some look at information here. And I also want to point your eyes towards the merit aid view as well. That can give you good information about whether or not merit aid is going to be something that's offered at these schools and whether that's something that you're automatically considered for or is that something that your child has to apply into. So whether you need financial aid or not, this can be a really helpful tool to think about, right? Especially maybe building some likely options, or maybe this has to be a part of your child's search process and centering those schools that really offer competitive merit aid. This is a really, 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 really helpful tool. And what I like about this too is that everything is hyperlinked. So for those who are applying for financial aid or have questions about affordability, you can click here on the calculator and it'll take you to each school's net price calculator, which you can fill out with your 2022 taxes and begin to have conversations about the pragmatic elements of affordability and what does that look like for you and your family. So Kickstarter is great because you don't have to hunt this information down. It is all here, neatly centralized for you all. So that is College Kickstart in a nutshell. And I know that I spoke quite a bit as I tend to do, but I want to, being mindful both of time and where we are there any questions from anyone? I know a few have come up in the text box, so I will look at that really quickly. But if anything comes up, please, this is your opportunity. Uh, so one question was, is the meeting you're describing at the meeting we talked about at the beginning, the second student meeting, but the family's first meeting? Yes. So the second meeting is our second meeting with the student, but your first meeting with the family, right? So we're having that collective conversation. Once we have that meeting, as I've explained to students, it's really up to them to figure out what they need moving forward. Some students are absolutely fine with those two meetings, our junior seminars, they feel good, they feel set, they don't really need us. Others want to meet with us to talk about recommendation letters. Others may want to talk about summer programs. Others may want to talk about adjustments to our research list. It all, we welcome it all. And we encourage you all as families, if there's moments where you just need to connect with your counselor without your child present, for whatever reason it may be, we also welcome that, right? So we have tons of time in our calendar, especially now that our seniors are in their IB programs, IB exams, and they're not on campus and we're not meeting with them with as much frequency. Whatever you need, please know that we are here and we are a resource for you. Another question that came up, what is the difference between College Kickstart and SCORE? Fabulous question. So as I mentioned, College Kickstart is a tool to help a child understand and use data to help them assess the balance of their overall college list. It can be used to perhaps find new college opportunities, but really it is kind of a tool to assess balance. SCORE is a tool that we will use to send documents. So in reality, while SCORE does have some interesting functions, they have some cool career assessments that your child can do. It also gives you the opportunity to search for colleges, by filtering out different criteria. The bulk of it really is to help us send and process documents. So when your child knows where they apply to, where they intend to apply to, our counselor letters, teacher letters, transcripts are all sent through SCORE. So this is why we use the program. This is kind of its core functionality for us, but we do encourage you all to use SCORE as it makes sense to do so. So perhaps it's a combination of using both SCORE and using College Kickstart. Another question is, will financial aid be based on 2020 or 2021? So 2020 will be the tax year that you will use for next year's application process. So it's the prior kind of, that's how you kind of think about the financial aid application. So for the 24-25 academic cycle, which is when your child will be a freshman in college, you're using your taxes from 2022. So please keep that in mind as you're having conversations, and more importantly, as you're having and filling out net price calculators now, you should have your 2022 taxes. Use that information because that will be an important guide about affordability. And it's important that you engage with your counselor about those conversations, right? We may not necessarily need to know the nitty gritty of your family's financial circumstances if you are not comfortable sharing with us, but we do want to make sure that we are appropriately guiding you and your children through this process. And for me, importantly, making sure that we're maximizing financial opportunities as much as possible. Um, the other question was, have you published a list of schools where this year's seniors will be attending? Congrats to them all. We have not officially done that just yet. Um, even though May 1st is when students are submitting their deposits to colleges, we know that some of our students are on wait lists. We know some of our students have to wait for their IB results to confirm their international decision. So some of this information is still in flux. But closer towards June, closer towards graduation, I will publish and share out the final list for the class of 2023. But I will shamelessly give them a shout out because on Instagram, they actually have a BFS Decisions 2023 page, which is not sanctioned by the school, but it's absolutely adorable. They self select into it, they have baby pictures, and they're celebrating one another. So if you're curious about following along, with what's happening with the senior class, this is really good information that the kids are self-selecting into if you're ever curious. Um, so it is 7:38. I am past my time. As always, if there are continued questions, please reach out to me. Please reach out to Naomi. Otherwise, thank you for your attention, for your energy. I will see you all during our next year seminar. Have a good evening. Have a good evening, everyone.